Welcome back, everyone. This is Betska, the Guru Coach, together with Raj Vashisht and our extremely knowledgeable guest today, Nick Breeze. And Nick, what we'd love to cover right now is you are an expert on the cops. Your book, COPOUT, I encourage everyone to read it. I'm going to read it. It sounds absolutely amazing. And so, Nick, how have the COPs evolved since that Paris Agreement in 2015? And what major obstacles have prevented more substantial progress on climate action? I know there are two questions in there, but take it away.
The cop out is really about the evolution of the cops from 2015 COP21 in Paris when the Paris Agreement was signed and everyone was jumping in the air. And you had this feeling, and this I think this is a really sort of key thing. You had this sense the the elites, the political elites around the world were going to save us. That they had done it. We could just stand back and say, "Oh, well done, guys. We'll go on and do whatever we normally do." And then, of course, you go to the next COP, and we have the first Donald Trump presidency during COP. He's elected, and you tangibly or viscerally feel this. There are people crying. It's quite an insane feeling to see the misery. And at the end, John Kerry gave a talk to the press, and so we're all in this sort of shaky tent, and he's giving this sort of completely opposite talk to what he gave in Paris, where the triumph in Paris was translated now to this sense of sadness in Morocco. But it was that gave birth to the sort of youth movement because the cops the problem with the cops political side is that everyone goes there with this mindset. Thousands of negotiators go there with a mindset that they're going to compete. They're all competing to try and get an agreement that serves their own interest. And as we were talking about it before, with these impacts around the world, we are all vulnerable to the impacts. So we need collaboration, not competition. And we go to the cops and everyone's horse trading for X, Y, Z, usually to be able to trade more fossil fuels. So you come out of Paris, you've got this situation where you've got a Paris Agreement, every nation's signed up to it, but it's not binding. So no one
Mm,
has to really do what they said they were going to do.
mm,
So that's one thing.
okay.
The second thing is that you've got hundreds, and these days it's thousands of fossil fuel lobbyists inside the COP, inside with access to the negotiations, drawing through the agreements that are being made and basically watering down efforts. So, you have that. Then you have on top of that that each government, well, not each government, but a lot of governments are playing to short-term politics because it could be to do with their election cycles. It
Yeah,
could be
yeah,
to
yeah.
do it could be to do with just economic short-term benefits and all the rest of it. And then, you have this how this is communicated outside the COP as a future problem, especially if you're in the global north, it's always a future problem. And of course, as this has gone on, the cops have relocated to very authoritarian countries. So we've moved to Egypt, then to the UAE, and we've just had one in Baku. And these are not countries where protesters are allowed to gather and be heard. They have to, at all of these last three COPs, you see the protesters getting in a permit to go and stand in a special designated area and make a load of noise. And then the sort of time's up and they're told to move on. Otherwise, you get thrown out, and you certainly couldn't do it outside in the streets. So
Wow.
this has also had another impact of the civil society voice, which is an integral part of the cops.
Yes.
So these are all the reasons why there's a lot of disaffection with the outcomes because they've become these sort of, well, especially in the last few years, they almost feel like an oil conference as opposed to a an oil and gas conference as opposed to a climate conference, because really people are they're doing oil and gas deals. And I had sort of first-hand experience discussing this at the last COP. And it's quite shocking when you see something like the fires in Los Angeles, the floods in Valencia, and you can go around the world with this.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, why is this happening? Why can't we stop it? Well, we can't stop it because people keep committing us to long term. These days it's gas, but gas is a extremely, methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas, and we're locking all this in for the future. And it's a drug basically. We're all hooked on this drug, and we are electrifying now faster, but not fast enough. And in the meantime, we are now facing decades of really bad feedbacks of fires, floods, droughts, could very high chance of widespread famine.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
the
Mm-hmm.
COPs do matter, and I think that where we can become very cynical, and it's hard not to when you go when you go to these events and you think, wow, this is an absolute joke. And then you really have to also think, well, the poorer countries in the world do not have another forum. They don't have another place where they can come to the table, sit
Yeah.
down facing the US, Canada, or the EU or China. This is the only place where they get to sit at the table and talk about these issues, even if they're ignored.
Mm.
Even if they're ignored, this is still a place where they get to be heard, and their messages are seeping out. So I think from that point, it's really important that we try to fight back and get the agenda back. We kick the fossil fuel lobbyists out. And it's going to be difficult, especially with the incoming US administration and so on. But it's important that we don't feel cowed, that we don't feel bullied, that we actually stand up and just keep pushing much harder, especially now that we know that we're all vulnerable. I think the Los Angeles fires are emblematic of
Mm-hmm.
all of our vulnerability, basically.
Mm-hmm. For sure. I was thinking about some of those tiny countries, islands like Tonga, for example. They've been losing their island, and and the cops brought that whole issue to global attention, which is a good thing. I'm really happy about that. But let's dig a little deeper into what are the most significant ways that governments have failed their citizens on climate change.
Simply by not taking the actions they should have taken in the 1990s.
Oh.
There was a lot that could have been done then that would have eradicated the problems we've got now. And they basic if we had transitioned, because we had all the same knowledge, and this was really brought home to me in Egypt at COP27, when there was a guy there who was talking about geoengineering, about engineering the climate, and so on. And he used to be the head of the World Trade Organization. He was the EU Commissioner for Trade for many years, going right back to the late 90s, early 2000s. And he said in Egypt, where 20 years ago, when I was younger, this wasn't such a problem. Today, it's frightening me and my kids and grandkids. And I just thought, so 20 years ago, when you were head of you were the EU Trade Commissioner and you went on to become the World Trade Organization,
Mm.
no one at any time, because the cops had been going for over 10 years then, no one at any time put any of this stuff on your desk? Or did you just ignore it because it was actually inconvenient to your trade talks to try and factor
Mm-hmm.
in this
Mm-hmm.
information? And I
Mm-hmm.
would say that there's a lot of people that we generally regard quite highly in terms of leadership from those days. You could say the Clinton era, the Tony Blair in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
who were really, I would say there's a lot of blame to lie at their feet
Feet.
for the
Mm-hmm.
problems we have now because they were in a position to transition away from fossil fuels. They could have brought in the legislation because you need structural changes. You need
Yeah.
policy changes that set the agenda that everyone else can then gather round and we can innovate towards and so on. But in 2012, I was in Vienna and I interviewed Dr. James Hansen, who was then the head of
Yeah.
NASA, Goddard Institute. And he said in 2012, if we wait another 10 years to try and do this, to try and get our emissions down, then I don't think we're going to manage it because the changes we'll need to do will be so great
Yeah.
that it's not going to be possible.
Mm-hmm.
And fast forward 13 years, and it's not just the same. We've actually ramped up our emissions much, much higher, and we seem to be um, planning on doing that for a while. Meanwhile, the ecosystems that we're all part of, it's like a big spider's web, is actually collapsing around us. So we're in a sort of terrible situation. I think Professor Johan Rockström describes where we are now in terms of the time we have to make the necessary changes as the safe operating space for humanity. And as we can see, it's becoming much less safe. So now we can try and envisage that we have this time space in which to act. And every time a politician says, "Oh no, we're not going to give up yet," and you have to remember that Canada, US, Norway, UK, the EU as a bloc, there are a lot of countries who could do this. We
Yeah.
don't have to force it straight away onto the poorest countries, but the richest countries could move to a post-fossil fuel economy if they wanted to, but they're
Mm-hmm.
choosing not to. And US, Canada, Norway, there's a sort of usual suspects all the time, Australia and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But it's become a huge issue, and that's the political failure. That's the structural failure.
And speaking of that, I mean, I have read so many reports that have come out of the UN, that say we have to do this, we have to do that, including let's stop eating meat or reduce the meat, la, 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 la. And it's like the UN has no power. There's no global power. And I know, people are concerned about the elitists and taking over the world and, all that stuff. But surely to God, with such a serious situation, these countries could come together and maybe under the UN banner or somebody else to say, okay, enough's enough. Enough's enough. And maybe, again, the Valencia floods and the California fires. And I mean, look
Well, you
what's
could talk
happening in
about,
Australia.
yeah,
Sorry.
and just to comment on that, I mean, my book, COPOUT, it's how governments have failed the people on climate because it is governments. The
Yeah.
UN, as you've
Yeah.
just discussed, is a framework. It provides the framework for countries to come together. It's a good thing because it's a place where we come and we try to discuss problems that extend beyond our national borders. And climate change doesn't carry passports. It doesn't stop at the border and ask permission to come over. These are global issues. The oceans are flowing between us all. We have nothing else apart from the UN. If the COP didn't exist, we'd have to create it. It's not my quote, but it's someone else's, and it's a true point. So it's incumbent upon all of us to make our governments act responsibly,
Yeah.
to go to these COPs, to go to these UN meetings in good faith, to collaborate and to come up with the answers we need. And they don't do that. And I think personally, I think that's criminal, and I think
Yeah.
it's where we need much stronger um, sort of.
Global leadership. Yeah.
Well, there you go. Yeah, in two words.
Yeah. All right, folks. Well, Nick, we're going to take a short pause. And everyone, you can see how riveting this conversation is. So please join us back for part 3 in a moment.